My name is Nara King, and at 32 years old, I was the person my family loved to hate. After my millionaire grandfather Otis died and left me his entire $45 million estate, my parents, who had ignored me all my life, tried to sue me for the money. They thought they were dragging a broke, incompetent accountant into court to crush her. When I walked into the courtroom, my mom rolled her eyes and my sister-in-law covered her nose like I smelled like trash. But when the judge took his seat, he froze. He did not look at my high-priced family. He looked at me with genuine fear. "Wait, the charges are against you," he said. "My family never knew who I really was, but the judge certainly did." Before I tell you how I turned their greed into their prison sentence, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been the black sheep who outgrew the flock. The heavy oak doors of the Cook County courtroom felt cold under my palms as I pushed them open. The air inside was stale, recycling the tension of 1,000 broken families before us. I was wearing my standard work attire, a charcoal gray suit that was clean but admittedly had seen better days. It was practical. It was invisible. Just like I had been to the King family for the last decade. As I stepped into the aisle, the first thing I heard was the sharp intake of breath from the front row. It was my mother, Vivian. She did not even try to whisper. "Look what the cat dragged in," she hissed, nudging my father Luther so hard his silk tie shifted. "Did she buy that suit at a Walmart clearance sale? Tell the bailiff to make her sit in the back row, Luther. I do not want her anywhere near the cameras." I kept my face neutral, my eyes fixed on the empty defendant table. This was the game they played. They used humiliation like a blunt force weapon, expecting me to crumble. I walked past them, my heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. I could smell them before I saw them. My mother was wearing Chanel No. 5, applied too heavily, as if to mask the scent of the desperate debt they were drowning in. My father Luther sat with his chin raised high, trying to look like the grieving son, but his eyes were darting around the room, calculating the value of everything he saw. And then there was Terrence, my older brother, the golden child. He was leaning back in his chair, scrolling on his phone, completely unbothered. Next to him sat his wife, Brittany. As I passed their bench, Brittany dramatically pulled a silk handkerchief from her purse and pressed it to her nose. "Terrence," she whispered loud enough for the court reporter to hear. "I hope she does not expect us to acknowledge her. I am allergic to the smell of failure." Terrence snorted, not looking up from his screen. "Let her have her little moment, babe. She probably took the bus here. She needs to see what real success looks like before we take everything back." I reached the defendant table and set down my worn leather briefcase. My hands were steady. They did not know that while they saw a sad woman in a cheap suit, I was looking at them and seeing numbers. I saw the lease agreement on Terrence's flashy watch. I saw the second mortgage my parents had taken out to pay for my mother's limited edition handbag. I saw the high-interest loan they had used to hire their lawyer, Mr. Sterling, who was currently looking at me like I was a bug he wanted to squash. Sterling was a shark known for aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. He leaned over the aisle, his smile showing too many teeth. "Ms. King," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I suggest you sign the settlement papers now. We are offering you $5,000 to walk away. It is more than you make in a year, I assume. Save yourself the embarrassment. We are going to paint you as exactly what you are. A manipulative leech who took advantage of a senile old man." I opened my briefcase and took out a single notepad and a pen. I did not look at him. "Mr. Sterling," I replied, my voice calm and low. "I suggest you check the routing number on the retainer check my parents gave you. I believe it is from a shell company that was flagged for tax evasion 3 days ago. You might want to make sure the check clears before you say another word." Sterling, blinking rapidly, pulled back as if he had been burned. He whispered furiously to my father, who turned a shade of purple I had not seen since I refused to lend him money for his gambling debts 5 years ago. "Who told you that?" my father snapped. "You do not know anything, you little sneak." "Silence," my mother hissed. "She is bluffing. She is just a low-level bookkeeper, Luther. She probably does not even know how to read a balance sheet properly. Just ignore her. I sat down and crossed my legs. They had no idea. To them, I was Nara, the quiet girl who drove a 10-year-old Honda and lived in a studio apartment. They did not know that for the past 7 years, I had been a senior forensic auditor for the Federal Reserve. They did not know that my job was to hunt down white-collar criminals exactly like the ones they were pretending to be. They did not know that the cheap suit was camouflage. I watched them preening in their seats, fixing their hair for the imaginary audience. They looked like royalty, but I knew they were rotting from the inside out. "All rise," the bailiff shouted, his voice booming off the high ceilings. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Washington walked in. The room went silent. Judge Washington was a legend in Chicago. He was tough fare and had zero tolerance for nonsense. He had put away mob bosses and corrupt politicians. My parents looked nervous but hopeful. They assumed that because they were the well-dressed, grieving family, the judge would naturally side with them against the disheveled daughter. Judge Washington sat down, adjusting his robes. He put on his reading glasses and picked up the case file. Estate of Otis King. He read, his voice deep and authoritative. Plaintiffs Luther and Vivian King, alleging undue influence and mental incapacity of the deceased. Defendant Nara King. He paused. He stopped moving. His hand froze halfway to his water glass. He looked at the name on the file again, then he looked down at the plaintiff table where my parents were putting on their best sad faces. Then he looked at the defense table. He looked at me. I met his gaze. I did not smile. I simply nodded once, a professional acknowledgement. Judge Washington took off his glasses slowly. He leaned forward over the bench, ignoring my parents entirely. "Ms. King," he said, and his tone was not the voice he used for defendants. It was the voice he used for colleagues. "It has been a long time." I stood up. "It has, Your Honor." The judge looked confused, almost bewildered. "I see you are listed as the defendant here. The last time I saw you was in the federal grand jury hearing regarding the Ponzi scheme last autumn. Your audit was the only reason we secured those convictions." A gasp went through the courtroom. It came from my mother. She grabbed my father's arm, her fingernails digging into his suit jacket. "What is he talking about?" she whispered frantically. "What audit?" Judge Washington ignored her. He looked at the file again, shaking his head. "You are the beneficiary of the Otis King estate, and these people are suing you for fraud." "Yes, Your Honor," I said clearly. "They claim I lack the financial literacy to manage the estate." Judge Washington actually laughed. A short, sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. He looked at Mr. Sterling, the shark lawyer who was suddenly sweating profusely. "Mr. Sterling, are you aware that the woman you are suing is a senior forensic auditor for the government? Are you aware that she specializes in detecting financial fraud and asset misappropriation?" Sterling stood up, his papers shuffling messily in his hands. We were not aware of the defendant's current employment status, Your Honor. We were under the impression she was a junior accountant." My brother Terrence jumped up, unable to contain himself. "That is a lie," he shouted, pointing a finger at me. "She is a nobody. She has been lying to you, Judge. She probably faked her credentials just like she faked that will." "Mom, tell him." "Sit down," my mother hissed, pulling Terrence back by his jacket. Her eyes were locked on me wide with a mixture of fear and fury. She looked like she was seeing me for the first time in her life, and she did not like what she saw. Judge Washington banged his gavel, the sound cracking like a whip. "Order," he commanded. "Mr. King, if you speak out of turn again, I will have you removed." He turned his eyes back to me, and for a second, I saw a glimmer of amusement. "Ms. King, it seems your family has made some serious allegations. They claim you manipulated your grandfather." I picked up my notepad. "I did not manipulate him, Your Honor, but I did protect him. And I have brought evidence not just to defend myself, but to show the court exactly why my grandfather cut them out of his will." Brittany, my sister-in-law, let out a scoff that sounded like a dying cat. "Evidence," she muttered. "What evidence could she possibly have? She was not even invited to the funeral. I turned my head slowly to look at her. Brittany was wearing a diamond necklace that I knew for a fact had been reported stolen to the insurance company 3 months ago to claim the payout. I looked at her neck, then I looked at her eyes. "I have everything, Brittany," I said softly, so only they could hear. "I have the bank statements, I have the emails, and I have the video from the hospital room the night grandfather died." The color drained from Brittany's face so fast, she looked like a ghost. My father went rigid. The arrogance that had filled the room when I walked in was evaporating, replaced by a thick, suffocating dread. They thought they were the hunters. They thought I was the prey. They were about to find out that they had trapped themselves in a cage with the one person who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. Judge Washington adjusted his glasses. "Very well. Let us proceed. Opening statements." As I sat back down, I saw my mother's hand shaking. She was not rolling her eyes anymore. She was staring at my briefcase, as if it contained a bomb. And she was right. It did. Mr. Sterling smoothed the front of his Italian silk suit and walked toward the jury box, even though there was no jury present for this preliminary hearing. He was performing for the court of public opinion and for the two reporters sitting in the back row scribbling furiously in their notebooks. He rested his hands on the railing and lowered his voice to a tone of practiced solemnity. "Your Honor, this case is tragic, not because of the amount of money involved, but because of the betrayal at its heart. We are here today because a loving family has been torn apart by the machinations of one individual who saw her grandfather not as a patriarch, but as a piggy bank." I sat perfectly still at the defense table. My spine did not touch the back of the chair. I watched Sterling weave his narrative with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. He painted a picture of my grandfather, Otis King, that was almost unrecognizable. He described him as a man in steep cognitive decline, a confused elderly gentleman who could not remember his own name, let alone the details of his $45 million estate. Sterling claimed that I had isolated Otis in his final months, cutting off his loving son Luther and his devoted grandson Terence so that I could whisper poison in his ear and guide his shaking hand to sign a new will. It was a compelling story. It was also a complete fabrication. But looking at my mother Vivian in the front row, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, you would think she was the grieving victim of the century. She caught my eye and smirked a tiny tightening of her lips that said, "We have you now." Sterling called my father to the stand. Luther King walked up the aisle with his head bowed, clutching a Bible as if his very life depended on it. He took the oath with a trembling voice. When he sat down, he looked at me with an expression of such profound disappointment that 10 years ago it might have broken my heart. Now I just saw a man who owed $600,000 to a loan shark in Vegas. Mr. King, Sterling asked gently, "Can you tell the court about your relationship with your father in his final days?" My father took a deep, shaky breath. "We were close. We were always close. I built my own business just to make him proud. But in those last 6 months, whenever I went to visit him at the estate, the gates were locked. The nurses told me he did not want to see anyone." He paused for dramatic effect and pointed a shaking finger at me. "But we knew it was her. She was the only one allowed inside. She kept him prisoner in his own home." "Objection," I said quietly, not standing up. Sterling spun around. "On what grounds, Ms. King?" I did not look at him. I looked at the judge. "Hearsay, Your Honor, and relevance. The witness is speculating on the intent of the deceased based on third-party information." Judge Washington nodded. "Sustained. Stick to facts, Mr. King." My father's face turned a darker shade of brown. The facts he spat out, dropping the sad old man act for a split second. "The facts are that I raised that girl. We gave her everything. A home, food, clothes. And how does she repay us? By stealing my inheritance. By stealing the legacy that belongs to my son Terence. He looked at the judge, tears finally squeezing out of his eyes. She is a poisonous snake, Your Honor. We warmed her in our bosom and she bit us the moment she smelled money. She has no heart. She has no soul. She just wants to live a life of luxury she did not earn. I looked down at my notepad. I wrote down the phrase, poisonous snake. Then I wrote down the date my father had tried to mortgage my grandfather's house without his permission 3 years ago. I wrote down the account number of the offshore shell company where he had been siphoning funds from his church's charity drive. I did not react. I did not frown. I did not sigh. My silence was filling the room. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. My mother Vivian leaned forward, whispering loudly to Brittany, "Look at her. She does not even care. She is sitting there like a statue. It proves everything Luther is saying. She is a sociopath." Brittany nodded, her blonde ponytail bobbing. "It is creepy. It is like she is not even human." Sterling finished his examination looking triumphant. He thought my silence was submission. He thought I was overwhelmed by the weight of their accusations. He did not know that in my line of work, silence is how you catch a liar. You let them talk. You let them fill the air with words and contradictions until they build their own cage. Then it was my brother Terrence's turn. He did not take the stand, but he was making his presence felt from the plaintiff's table. He was shifting in his seat, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the floor. He was used to me shrinking. He was used to the little sister who cried when he broke her toys, or the teenager who hid in her room when he brought his loud friends over. He wanted a reaction. He needed it to validate his anger. He glared at the back of my head. I could feel his eyes boring into me. He coughed loudly. Then he cleared his throat. Finally, he leaned forward and hissed, "Stop writing. What are you even writing? You are broke, Nara. Stop pretending you are doing something important." I turned the page of my notepad. The sound was crisp and loud in the quiet courtroom. I picked up my pen again and continued writing. I was listing the discrepancies in Terrence's real estate license application, which I had pulled from the public records the night before. Terrence snapped. He stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward and clattered onto the floor. The noise made everyone jump except me and Judge Washington. "Say something!" Terrence screamed, his face contorted with rage. His veins bulged in his neck. "You sit there acting like you are better than us. You are nothing. You are a thief. Defend yourself if you are so innocent. Or are you too scared to speak? Are you mute now? Give me back my money, Nara. It is mine. Grandpa built that empire for me, not for a loser like you." The courtroom erupted. My mother gasped, pulling at Terrence's arm. Brittany looked horrified but thrilled by the drama. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand moving to his belt. I slowly capped my pen. I placed it perfectly parallel to the edge of my notebook. Then I looked up at Terrence. I did not shout. I did not look angry. I looked at him with the same expression I used when I found a discrepancy in a tax return. Pity mixed with professional curiosity. Judge Washington slammed his gavel down. Bang, bang, bang. "Order!" the judge bellowed, his voice filling the room. "Mr. King, you will sit down and be silent, or I will hold you in contempt of court and have you removed immediately. This is a court of law, not a schoolyard." Terrence, breathing heavily, glared at me one last time before righting his chair and sinking into it. He looked like a petulant child who had been told no for the first time in his life. He adjusted his suit jacket, muttering under his breath, but he did not speak again. The room fell into a tense silence. The air was vibrating with the energy of the outburst. My parents looked shaken but righteous, as if Terrence's anger was justified. Sterling looked annoyed that his client had lost control, but confident that the emotional display had garnered sympathy. Then Judge Washington turned his gaze back to me. He did not look at the screaming man. He looked at the woman who had not moved a muscle. His eyes were dark and intelligent. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen me dismantle complex fraud schemes with nothing but a spreadsheet and a calm demeanor. He knew that my silence was not fear. It was ammunition. Ms. King, the judge, said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. You have heard the opening arguments and the testimony of your father. You have been accused of undue influence fraud and elder abuse. These are serious charges. Do you have a response? I stood up. I picked up my briefcase. I felt the weight of the evidence inside it. It was heavy. It was undeniable. I looked at my parents, who were watching me with a mix of hatred and anticipation, waiting for me to beg or stumble. I looked at Terrence, who was seething. I looked at Brittany, who was checking her reflection in her phone screen. Yes, Your Honor, I said, my voice steady and clear. I do not have a response. I have the truth, and I would like to begin by calling my first witness. The judge leaned back in his chair. A very small, very faint smile played at the corner of his lips. He nodded. Proceed, Ms. King. I walked to the center of the room. I did not look at my family. I looked past them to the door where the bailiff was waiting. I called to the stand Ms. Evelyn Parker, the head nurse who cared for Otis King during the last 6 months of his life. My mother's face went white. She grabbed Luther's hand. Evelyn Parker was supposed to be on their side. They had paid her $10,000 just this morning to lie for them. They thought she was their ace in the hole. They did not know that I knew about the transfer, and they certainly did not know what I was about to ask her. The memory of that day hit me like a physical blow even as I stood in the center of the courtroom waiting for the bailiff to open the doors. It was exactly 30 days ago that we laid my grandfather to rest, but the cold dampness of that morning still clung to my skin. I had driven my 10-year-old Honda Civic to the Greater Grace Temple, the massive stone church my grandfather had helped build with his own hands 50 years ago. The parking lot was already filled with luxury SUVs and rented limousines, a parade of wealth that felt grotesque against the gray sky. I parked in the far corner between a beat-up pickup truck and a dumpster because I knew better than to park next to my brother's leased Bentley. As I walked toward the towering oak double doors of the main entrance, I saw my mother Vivian holding court on the steps. She was wearing a black dress that cost more than my entire college tuition, and a hat with a veil so wide it looked like a satellite dish. She was laughing at something a local politician was saying, her hand resting casually on his arm. The moment she saw me, her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer annoyance, as if I were a stain on her perfect picture. She excused herself from the politician and intercepted me before I could even reach the first step. She blocked my path, her body acting as a physical barrier between me and the sanctuary. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You cannot go in through this door, Nara. Look at you. You are wearing off-the-rack polyester. This entrance is for VIPs. It is for Terrence's business partners and the city council members. We are networking today. We are securing the family legacy. We do not need you dragging down the property value with your presence." I looked at her, trying to find a shred of grief in her eyes, but there was none. There was only calculation. This was not a funeral to her. It was a gala. It was a launch party for their new life as multimillionaires. "Go around to the back," she commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the alley where the kitchen staff took their breaks. "Use the service entrance. That is where you belong. And for heaven's sake, sit in the back. Do not let anyone see you." I did not argue. I did not scream. I simply adjusted my bag, walked around the building, and entered through the heavy steel door next to the dumpster. The kitchen smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I walked past the catering staff, who were preparing trays of lobster sliders for the reception I had not been invited to. I slipped into the sanctuary from the side door just as the organ music swelled. The church was packed. Flowers covered every inch of the altar, white lilies and roses arranged in massive, towering displays that screamed money. And there in the front row, sitting directly next to the mahogany casket, was Brittany. My sister-in-law was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She was wearing a black dress cut so low it was scandalous, and she was dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief every time she saw a camera phone point in her direction. She was sobbing loudly, her shoulders shaking, making sure everyone knew she was the grieving granddaughter-in-law. It made my stomach turn. I knew for a fact that Brittany hated Otis. She called him a stingy old miser behind his back. She had refused to visit him in the hospital because she said the smell of antiseptic made her nauseous. But now that he was dead and leaving behind a fortune, she was the picture of devastation. She leaned her head on Terrence's shoulder, and he patted her arm distractedly while checking his watch. He looked bored. He looked like he was waiting for a business meeting to start, not saying goodbye to the man who raised him. I walked down the side aisle looking for a seat. The ushers who knew exactly who I was looked right through me. The first 10 rows were reserved for family and distinguished guests. My name was not on any of the reserved cards. I kept walking back and back until I reached the very last pew against the wall. There was one other person sitting there. It was Mrs. Higgins, the woman who had cleaned my grandfather's house for 20 years. She was wearing a simple black dress and holding a worn Bible. She was crying silent, genuine tears. When she saw me, she moved over and patted the space next to her. She was the only person in that entire building who offered me any comfort. We sat together, the help and the granddaughter invisible in the shadows, while the kings preened in the spotlight. Then my father, Luther, walked up to the pulpit to deliver the eulogy. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd with a practiced solemnity. He spoke about Otis King, the businessman. He spoke about the buildings Otis owned, the deals he made, the empire he constructed. He did not speak about Otis, the man who liked strawberry ice cream, or the man who taught me how to fish. My father's voice boomed through the speakers. My father was a visionary, he declared. He knew that to survive in this world, you have to be strong. You have to be ruthless. And he knew that his legacy needed to be placed in hands that could carry it forward. That is why today, as we say goodbye, we also look to the future. A future where King Enterprises, under the leadership of my son Terrence, will take the assets my father left behind and triple them. It was a sales pitch. It was a declaration of ownership. He was telling the entire city of Chicago that the money was theirs before the body was even cold. Terrence nodded from the front row, looking smug. Brittany checked her makeup in her compact mirror. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. They were dancing on his grave. They were stripping him for parts. I could not sit there for another second. I could not watch them turn his memory into a commodity. I squeezed Mrs. Higgins' hand, stood up, and walked out the back door before the service was even over. The air outside was biting and cold, but it felt clean compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I walked toward my car, my heels crunching on the gravel. I was halfway to my parking spot when a black sedan pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a gray-haired man in a wool coat looked out. It was Mr. Harrison, my grandfather's personal attorney. He had been Otis's lawyer for 40 years, a man of few words and absolute integrity. "Ms. King," he said, his voice gravelly. "I noticed you leaving. I cannot say I blame you. It is quite a spectacle in there." I stopped, hugging my coat tighter around myself. "They do not care about him, Mr. Harrison. They only care about what he left behind." He nodded slowly, unlocking his car door and stepping out. He looked around to make sure we were alone, then he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a velvet cloth. He pressed it into my hand. His fingers were warm and his grip was firm. "Your grandfather knew this would happen," Mr. Harrison said softly. "He knew they would turn his funeral into a networking event. He told me that if you walked out early, I was to give you this." I unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a single silver key. It looked old, simple, and unpretentious. "What is this?" I asked. "It is for a safety deposit box at the First National Bank downtown," Mr. Harrison explained. "Box number 402. Your grandfather placed something inside it 3 days before he died. He said it was the only thing that mattered. He said that when the wolves came for you, and he knew they would come, you were to open that box." I stared at the key. My grandfather had been playing a long game even on his deathbed. He had seen everything. He had seen their greed, their neglect, and their arrogance. "Do not tell anyone you have this," Mr. Harrison warned, glancing toward the church where the sound of applause was actually ringing out. following my father's speech. They think the will reading next week is a formality. They think they have already won. Let them think that. Let them get comfortable. He got back into his car and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the wind. I clutched the key so hard it cut into my palm. Inside that church, my family was celebrating their victory. They were shaking hands and making deals over my grandfather's corpse. But out here in the cold, I held the truth. I got into my Honda, tossed the velvet cloth onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. I did not cry. I did not look back at the church. I drove straight to the bank. They had the show, but I had the key. And as I drove away, I realized that my father was right about one thing. A legacy was about to be passed down. He just had no idea whose hands it was actually falling into. The mahogany library of the King estate smelled of lemon polish and unbridled greed. It was a week after the funeral, and my family had gathered like vultures circling a carcass that had finally stopped moving. They were not mourning. They were shopping. My sister-in-law, Brittany, was already on her phone scrolling through a digital catalog for luxury interior designers. She was loudly discussing how she planned to gut this very room because the dark wood was too depressing and she wanted something more modern and chic. My brother Terence was sitting at the head of the table where my grandfather used to sit, his feet propped up on the antique leather. He was on a call with a yacht broker in Miami, talking about a deposit for a vessel named the Sovereign. He did not have the money for a dinghy, let alone a yacht, but in his mind the $45 million was already in his bank account. My parents Luther and Vivian were huddled together whispering about real estate. I could hear snippets of their conversation. They were planning to buy a vacation home in Martha's Vineyard and pay off the loan sharks who had been threatening to break my father's legs for the past 3 months. They looked giddy like children on Christmas morning. I sat in the corner on a stiff wooden chair, the only one not participating in the fantasy. They had barely acknowledged my presence when I walked in, except for my mother telling me not to touch the refreshments, because they were for the beneficiaries. The double doors opened and Mr. Harrison walked in. He was followed by 2 large men in dark suits who positioned themselves quietly by the door. My family was too busy counting their imaginary money to notice the security detail, but I saw them. Mr. Harrison sat down at the opposite end of the table from Terence. He opened his briefcase with a sharp click that silenced the room. He did not look at my parents. He did not look at Terence. He looked at me for a split second, his eyes filled with a sad kindness, before he put on his reading glasses. He cleared his throat. I am here to read the last will and testament of Otis King. The family leaned forward. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. My mother actually licked her lips. Mr. Harrison began to read. He went through the standard legal jargon, the revocation of previous wills, the payment of debts. Then he got to the distribution of assets. My father Luther straightened his tie, ready to receive his empire. To my son Luther King, Mr. Harrison read, his voice flat and emotionless. I leave my collection of vintage ties. You always admired them more than you admired the man wearing them. Beyond this personal property, I leave you nothing. The silence in the room was absolute. My father blinked. He laughed, a nervous, stuttering sound. That is a joke, right? He loved his jokes. Read the real part, Harrison. Mr. Harrison did not look up. To my daughter-in-law, Vivian, I leave my Bible. I suggest you read the commandments, specifically the ones about coveting and stealing. I leave you nothing. My mother let out a strangled gasp, clutching her pearls. This is outrageous. He was senile. You wrote this yourself, Harrison. To my grandson, Terence. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice rising over my mother's protests. I leave the sum of $1. This is to ensure you cannot contest this will by claiming you were forgotten. You were not forgotten, Terence. You were observed. I leave you nothing else. Terence slammed his fist onto the table. The yacht brochure slid onto the floor. This is bullshit. I am the heir. I am the only one who knows how to run this family. Who gets it then? Who gets the money? Mr. Harrison turned the page. Yo. He took off his glasses and looked directly at my family. The entirety of the estate, including the King Enterprises stock portfolio, the real estate holdings in Chicago and New York, the offshore accounts, and the family trust valued at approximately $45 million is bequeathed to my granddaughter, Nara King. For 3 seconds, there was no sound in the room. No breathing, no movement. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the space. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I did not smile. I did not cheer. I just watched them. Then the explosion happened. My mother screamed. It was a primal, animalistic shriek of pure rage. She stood up so fast her chair flew backward. "You little witch!" she screamed at me. Her face was twisted into a mask of ugly fury. "You did this! You poisoned him against us! You stole our life!" She grabbed the porcelain teacup in front of her. It was filled with scalding hot Earl Grey. Without hesitating, she hurled it across the room at me. The cup shattered against my shoulder. The hot liquid splashed across my neck and chest, soaking into my cheap blouse. The pain was immediate and searing, a sharp burn that made my skin scream. But I did not flinch. I did not cry out. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me in pain. Terence roared and lunged across the table. "I am going to kill you!" he shouted, his hands reaching for my throat. "You thief! That is my money!" He never reached me. The 2 men by the door moved with terrifying speed. One of them intercepted Terence mid-air, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him back into his chair with enough force to crack the wood. The other stepped in front of me, a solid wall of muscle between me and my family. "Sit down," Mr. Harrison commanded, his voice like a whip. "If you touch her again, I will have you arrested for assault right here and now. The police are already on standby outside the gate." Otis anticipated this reaction. My father was hyperventilating, clutching his chest. "This cannot be real." "Nara, tell him. Tell him this is a mistake. You cannot handle that kind of money. You are a nobody. Give it back to us. We will take care of you. We will give you an allowance." I stood up slowly. My shoulder was throbbing where the tea had burned me. Water dripped from my chin. I took a napkin from the table and deliberately, calmly wiped the liquid from my face. I looked at my mother, who was panting with exertion and hate. I looked at my brother, who was being held down by a security guard. I looked at my father, who was begging for scraps. I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but in that silent room, it sounded like thunder. "You will not get a penny. Not an allowance, not a loan, not a gift. You get nothing." My mother sneered. "Why?" "Because you are greedy. Because you want to hoard it all for yourself while your family starves." "No, mother," I said. "Because grandfather knew what she spat. He knew who pulled the plug on grandmother." The color drained from my mother's face so fast she looked like a corpse. My father froze. The room went deadly silent again, but this time it was the silence of terror. 5 years ago, my grandmother had been on life support. The doctors said she might recover. But she died suddenly one night when the machines were turned off. My parents claimed it was a malfunction. They claimed it was God's will. They collected the life insurance payout 2 weeks later and bought their first luxury car. I saw the security footage. I continued. Grandfather saw it too. He kept it in a safe deposit box. He watched you walk into that hospital room, mother. He watched you turn off the ventilator while Dad stood by the door and watched. He never forgave you. And he spent the rest of his life protecting his money so that the people who murdered his wife would never enjoy the fruit of his labor. My mother collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of guilt and terror. Terence looked at his parents with horror, not because of what they did, but because he realized the money was truly gone. I picked up my bag. Mr. Harrison handed me a folder. I did not look back at them. I walked out of the library, leaving the smell of lemon polish and fear behind me. My shoulder burned, but the fire inside me burned hotter. The war had just begun, and I had just fired the first shot. The courtroom doors swung open, and the bailiff called out the name, Evelyn Parker. A hush fell over the gallery as a small, unassuming woman in a floral dress walked tentatively toward the witness stand. To the untrained eye, she looked like the picture of a dedicated caregiver, the kind of woman who had spent her life fluffing pillows and holding the hands of the dying. But as she passed the defense table, I caught the scent of her perfume. It was expensive, far too expensive for a nurse on a standard salary. She avoided my gaze, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor until she took her seat and placed her hand on the Bible to swear to tell the truth. I watched her hand tremble just slightly. It was the only crack in her facade. Mr. Sterling approached the stand with the confidence of a man who believes he has already won. He smiled at Evelyn, a warm, encouraging smile that made my stomach turn. Ms. Parker, you were the primary caregiver for Mr. Otis King during the final 6 months of his life, is that correct? Yes, sir, she replied, her voice soft and wavering just enough to elicit sympathy. I was with him every day. I cooked his meals. I managed his medication. I was his companion when he had no one else. Sterling nodded gravely. And during that time, did you observe the defendant Nara King interacting with her grandfather? Evelyn finally looked at me. Her eyes were wide and filled with a practiced fear. Yes, I did. She came every evening, but it was not to visit him. She would send me out of the room. She told me I was not needed. And when I would come back, Mr. King would be agitated. He would be confused. He would ask me why his son Luther never came to see him. My father let out a loud sob from the plaintiff's table, burying his face in his hands. It was a masterful performance. Sterling pressed on. Did Nara ever give you instructions regarding Mr. King's family? Yes, she whispered, leaning into the microphone. She told me that if Luther or Terence came to the gate, I was not to open it. She said they were not welcome. She said Mr. King did not want to see them. But I knew that was a lie. Mr. King cried for his son. He begged to see his grandson. But Nara held the power of attorney. I was afraid of her. She threatened to have me fired if I disobeyed. A murmur of outrage rippled through the courtroom. I could feel the eyes of the spectators burning into my back. To them, I was a monster who had kept a dying man from his loving family. Sterling lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Ms. Parker, did you ever notice anything unusual about Mr. King's medication after Nara had visited? Evelyn dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Yes. Sometimes after she left, he would be so drowsy he could not speak. He would be hallucinating. I suspect she was giving him extra doses of his painkillers. She wanted him pliable. She wanted him confused so he would sign whatever papers she put in front of him. That was the nail in the coffin. Accusing me of over-medicating him was not just undue influence, it was assault. It was criminal. My mother, Vivian, turned in her seat to look at me. Her lips were curled into a sneer of pure triumph. She nodded at me slowly, her eyes gleaming with malice. She thought she had destroyed me. She thought this was the moment I would break down and beg for mercy. I looked back at her, and I did not blink. I did not frown. I simply adjusted the cuff of my blazer and turned my attention to my laptop screen. While Evelyn had been weaving her fairy tale, I had been working. I had logged into the secure server I used for my forensic audits. I had run a query on Evelyn Parker's social security number. It was a breach of protocol technically, but I was fighting for my life and my grandfather's legacy. I found exactly what I knew I would find. I leaned over to my lawyer, Mr. Harrison. He looked pale. The testimony was damaging, and he knew it. I slid my laptop toward him and pointed to the highlighted line on the spreadsheet. His eyes widened. He looked at me, then back at the screen, then up at the witness stand. The color returned to his cheeks. He stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket. Your witness, Mr. Harrison, said to Sterling, who swept his hand toward the podium with a gracious mock bow. Mr. Harrison walked toward Evelyn Parker. He did not smile. He did not use a gentle voice. Ms. Parker, you stated that you were afraid of my client, is that correct? Yes, sir, she said, clutching her tissue. She is very intimidating. And you stated that you cared deeply for Otis King. I loved him like my own father. Mr. Harrison nodded. You loved him so much that you allowed his granddaughter to drug him and isolate him without ever calling the police, without ever calling Adult Protective Services, without ever calling his son Luther. You just watched it happen, Evelyn stammered. I needed the job. I has bills to pay. I was scared. Bills to pay? Mr. Harrison repeated. That is interesting. Because according to your employment records, you were paid very generously by the King estate. But I suppose everyone can use a little extra help. He walked back to the defense table and picked up a piece of paper I had just printed out from the portable printer in my briefcase. He held it up, but he did not look at it. He looked straight at Evelyn. Ms. Parker, can you explain to the court why a shell company registered to a Mr. Terrence King wired $10,000 into your personal checking account at 8:45 this morning? The silence that followed was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a bomb that had just detonated, and everyone was waiting for the shockwave. Evelyn's mouth dropped open. Her face went from flushed to a sickly gray in less than a second. Her eyes darted to Terrence, who was suddenly very interested in the pattern of the wood grain on the table in front of him. I do not know what you are talking about, she squeaked. Mr. Harrison walked up to the witness stand and placed the bank statement in front of her. This is a certified record of the transaction, Ms. Parker. It shows the routing number, the sender, and the timestamp. 8:45 a.m., 45 minutes before court started. Did you sell your testimony, Ms. Parker? Did you sell your loyalty to a dying man for $10,000? Objection, Sterling shouted, jumping up. This is ambush. We have not seen this evidence. It is impeachment evidence, counsel. Judge Washington boomed, his voice cutting through the chaos. And if the witness has committed perjury, I suggest you sit down before you implicate yourself in suborning it. The judge turned his terrifying gaze on Evelyn. Ms. Parker, I am going to ask you one time. Is that your bank account? Evelyn looked at the judge, then at Terrence, then at my parents. She saw no help there. They were already distancing themselves physically, leaning away from her, as if she were contagious. She realized she was the sacrificial lamb. She realized she was going to jail for them, and they would not lift a finger to stop it. She broke. Yes, she sobbed, collapsing forward onto the railing. Yes, it is mine. They told me to say it. Terrence told me what to say. He said if I helped them get the money, they would give me a bonus. I have debt, Your Honor. I did not want to lie, but they made me. Nara never hurt him. She was the only one who cared about him. She was the only one who brushed his hair and read to him. They never came. Not once. Pandemonium broke out. The gallery exploded with whispers and gasps. My mother sat frozen, her mouth agape, her earlier triumph turning into ash in her mouth. Terrence was shaking his head vigorously, mouthing, "She is lying. She is lying," but no one was looking at him. They were looking at me. I stood up slowly, holding another document in my hand. It was the original logbook from the security gate at my grandfather's estate. I held it up for the judge to see. Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. This is the visitor log for the last 6 months of my grandfather's life. It shows that I visited 180 times. It shows that Luther King visited 0 times, Vivian King 0 times, and Terrence King 0 times. The only time they came to the gate was the day after he died, to ask where the safe was. Judge Washington banged his gavel so hard I thought the handle would snap. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He looked at my parents with an expression of pure disgust. Mr. Sterling, control your clients. And Mrs. Parker, you will step down and wait for the bailiff to escort you into custody. Perjury is a felony in my court. As the bailiff led the weeping nurse away, I looked at my mother. She was not rolling her eyes anymore. She was trembling. She looked at me, And for the first time, I saw the realization dawn on her. She had not just underestimated me. She had walked into a trap I had been setting for years. I had not just been visiting my grandfather. I had been documenting. I had been preparing. And I was just getting started. I sat back down and opened the next file on my laptop. It was time to show them exactly what a forensic auditor does when she finds a discrepancy in the ledger. It was time to balance the books. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed behind me, muting the buzz of whispers and speculation. Judge Washington had called for a 15-minute recess, a brief respite before the real war began. I did not need a break. I was running on adrenaline and the cold, hard fuel of justice. But I needed water, and I needed to wash the invisible slime of my family's lies off my skin. I made my way to the women's restroom down the hall, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. I pushed open the door to the restroom. It was empty, smelling of industrial soap and lavender air freshener. I walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and let the cold water run over my wrists. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was calm, my eyes were clear. I did not look like a victim. I looked like a hunter. The door swung open again, harder this time, banging against the wall. I did not have to look up to know who it was. The scent of cloying, overly floral perfume announced her arrival before she even stepped into the frame. Brittany, my brother's wife. The woman who thought she was the queen of Chicago because she married a man with a leased Bentley and a mountain of debt. She did not use the toilet. She did not check her makeup. She walked straight up to me, standing just behind my shoulder so she could glare at my reflection in the glass. She crossed her arms over her chest, the diamonds on her wrist catching the fluorescent light. They were real, or at least high-quality fakes. With Brittany, it was always hard to tell where the lie ended and the person began. "You think you are clever, Dawn, to you?" She spat, her voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Sitting in there playing the silent martyr. Do you really think anyone buys it? You are just a little mouse, Nara. A little gray mouse trying to steal cheese from the lions." I reached for the soap dispenser, pumping a dollop of pink foam into my palm. I began to lather my hands slowly, methodically. "Lions hunt Brittany," I said, my voice conversational. "Lions kill. My brother and parents are not lions. They are scavengers. And you are just the bird picking the bugs off their backs." Her face twisted. The mask of high society elegance slipped, revealing the mean girl underneath. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. "You listen to me," she hissed. "You do not deserve that money. You are a glorified calculator, a bookkeeper. What are you going to do with $45 million? Buy more ugly suits. Terrence has a vision. He is building an empire. He needs capital to expand. That money belongs to him by right of birth, by right of potential. You are just you." She looked me up and down, her lip curling in disgust. It was a look I knew well. It was the look she gave the waitstaff when they brought the wrong wine. It was the look she gave me at Christmas when I gave her a handmade scarf instead of a designer belt. It was a look that said, "You are beneath me. Know your place, Nara," she continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Sign the transfer papers. Give it back to the family. If you do, maybe we will let you keep a few thousand. Enough to fix your teeth or buy a car that doesn't sound like a lawnmower. But if you keep this up, we will destroy you. Terrence has friends. Powerful friends. You are out of your depth." I rinsed my hands, watching the soap swirl down the drain. It took the dirt with it. I wished I could wash her away as easily. I turned off the tap and reached for a paper towel. I dried my hands, taking my time, letting the silence stretch until it was tight enough to snap. Then I turned to face her. I leaned back against the sink, crossing my ankles. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the tension around her eyes. I saw the slight tremor in her hand. I saw the desperation she was trying so hard to hide under layers of bravado and hairspray. "You talk a lot about value, Brittany," I said softly. "About worth. About what is real and what is fake." I let my eyes drift down to the handbag hanging from her shoulder. It was a black Birkin, the kind that costs as much as a small house. She wore it like a shield. Speaking of fake, you might want to be careful with that bag. The stitching on the handle is uneven. And the hardware, it is too shiny. Real palladium doesn't gleam like cheap chrome. Brittany gasped, clutching the bag instinctively to her side. How dare you? This is authentic. Terrence bought it for me in Paris. Terrence bought it from a trunk in Canal Street, I corrected her. I saw the credit card charge on his statement during my audit. $300, a steal really for such a convincing counterfeit. But then again, everything about your life is a counterfeit, isn't it? The cars, the house, the happiness. It is all leased, borrowed, or fake. Her face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. Her eyes bulged. The insult to her status was more painful than any physical blow. She let out a shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. "You bitch!" she screamed. She lunged at me. Her hand came up, palm open, aiming for my face. She wanted to slap me. She wanted to put me back in my place, to physically assert the dominance she felt she was losing. It was a slow, clumsy move. I didn't even have to move my feet. I simply raised my left hand and caught her wrist in midair. I didn't squeeze hard, just enough to stop her momentum, just enough to hold her there, suspended in her own violence. She gasped, trying to yank her arm back, but I held fast. My grip was iron. I wasn't just a bookkeeper who sat at a desk all day. I was a field agent who had been trained to detain suspects who didn't want to be audited. "Do not," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming cold and hard as the marble floor. "Do not ever try to touch me again. You are not the bully on the playground anymore, Brittany, and I am not the victim." She stared at me, fear flickering in her eyes for the first time. She stopped struggling. I leaned in closer. I moved into her personal space until I could smell the stale coffee on her breath beneath the mints. I lowered my voice to a whisper, intimate and terrifying. "You are worried about the bag," I murmured. "You are worried about the money. You are worried about your reputation." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But if I were you, I would be worrying about something else entirely." I let my gaze drop from her eyes down to her stomach. It was flat, hidden beneath the designer dress, but I knew what was there. I knew what the medical records said. I knew what the credit card charges at the OB/GYN clinic indicated. "I would be worrying about the baby, Brittany," I whispered. She froze. Her entire body went rigid. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Oh, Donda looks so surprised," I said, a small, cruel smile playing on my lips. "I am an auditor. I see everything. I see the prenatal vitamins on the pharmacy bill. I see the appointments. It is wonderful news, really. A baby is a blessing." I released her wrist. She stumbled back, clutching it to her chest, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Does Terrence know?" I asked, my voice feigning innocence. "Does he know he is going to be a father? Or is that another little secret you are keeping? Because looking at the dates on the ultrasound charges, the math is interesting, isn't it?" Terrence was in Dubai for 3 weeks during conception, but his personal trainer wasn't T. Brittany, looked like she was going to be sick. She backed away until she hit the paper towel dispenser. She was shaking her head mutely, pleading with me to stop, to not say it, to not make it real. "Go back to the courtroom, Brittany," I said, turning back to the mirror to adjust my collar. "Fix your face. Sit down next to your husband, and pray. Pray that I decide to be merciful. Because right now your entire future is held together by a thread, and I am holding the scissors." I walked past her, pushing open the door and stepping back into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew she was still standing there, paralyzed in the cold fluorescent light, realizing that the sister-in-law she had mocked and belittled was not just a threat to her bank account. I was a threat to her entire existence, and I was just getting started. Mr. Sterling resumed his pacing in front of the bench, his confidence restored by the success of his previous witness. He gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if I were a stain on the courtroom floor. "Your Honor, we must consider the practical implications of this will." Even if we ignore the undue influence for a moment, let us look at the beneficiary herself. Ms. King drives a 10-year-old Honda Civic. She lives in a rented studio apartment in a neighborhood that most of us would avoid after dark. She has no investment portfolio, no assets, no experience managing wealth of any kind. My mother Vivian nodded vigorously from the front row. She leaned over to Brittany and whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. She cannot even afford decent shoes. Look at those scuffed heels. It is embarrassing. Sterling continued, his voice rising in a crescendo of mock concern. To hand over an estate of $45 million to someone so financially illiterate would be negligent. It would be a disaster. She would squander it in a year on bad investments and frivolous spending. She is a low-level bookkeeper, Your Honor. She probably struggles to balance her own checkbook, let alone a multi-million-dollar trust. She simply does not have the capacity to understand the complexity of her grandfather's legacy. Judge Washington cleared his throat. It was a deep rumbling sound that stopped Sterling mid-sentence. The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the polished wood of the bench. He did not look angry. He looked amused. Mr. Sterling, the judge asked, his voice deceptively mild. In your extensive research for this lawsuit, did you happen to verify the defendant as current employment status? Sterling blinked, confused by the interruption. He glanced at my father, who shrugged helplessly, then looked back at the judge. Of course, Your Honor. As I said, she is a junior accountant at a local firm. We have her tax returns from 5 years ago, which show a very modest income. 5 years ago, the judge repeated slowly. He reached for a file that was sitting separately from the court documents. It was a thick folder with a government seal on the front. He opened it with deliberate care. It seems your research is somewhat outdated, counselor. The judge looked directly at me. There was a spark of recognition in his eyes, a shared history that my family knew nothing about. Mr. Sterling, the judge, continued, his voice hardening steel entering his tone. Ms. King is not a junior accountant. She is a senior forensic auditor for the Federal Reserve. The silence that fell over the courtroom was absolute. It was heavier than the silence in the library had been. It was the silence of a vacuum where all the air had been sucked out of the room instantly. The court reporter stopped typing. The bailiff looked up from his phone. Excuse me, Sterling stammered, his confident facade cracking. I do not think I heard you correctly. I think you did, the judge said. I know this because I signed the warrant she requested last year. Ms. King is the lead investigator who uncovered the $50 million Ponzi scheme run by the former city treasurer. She traced assets through 20 different shell companies across 3 continents. She did not just help put him in prison, Mr. Sterling. She wrote the textbook on how to catch him. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Reporters who had been half asleep in the back row were suddenly typing furiously on their phones. I looked at my parents. Their mouths were hanging open. They looked like fish pulled out of water, gasping for air. For 32 years they had called me a failure. They had mocked my job. They had called me boring. They had never once asked me about my day. They had never asked me what I was working on. To them, I was just Nara, the disappointment, the girl who liked math and wore boring clothes. They had no idea that the boring girl was hunting monsters. My mother turned to my father, her eyes wide with panic and confusion. Luther, she whispered, her voice trembling. Did you know? Why did you not know? My father shook his head, staring at me as if I were a stranger who had just walked in off the street. No. I thought she just filed tax returns. She does, I said, speaking for the first time since the recess. My voice was calm, cutting through the murmurs in the room. I file tax returns for people who try to hide money from the government, and I am very, very good at it. Judge Washington smiled, a cold, sharp smile. Indeed, she is. So, Mr. Sterling, unless you have evidence that a federal auditor lacks the financial literacy to manage her own grandfather's estate, I suggest you move on to a different line of questioning. And be careful, counselor. You are swimming with a shark, and you did not even know you were in the water. Sterling looked down at his notes. His hands were shaking visibly now. He had built his entire case on my incompetence. He had built his strategy on the idea that I was weak and stupid. Now he was staring at the person who hunted people like him for a living. He looked at my family, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes too. He realized they had not told him the truth because they did not know it. They had walked him into a trap, and the jaws were about to snap shut. The courtroom lights dimmed, casting long shadows against the paneled walls, as the mechanical hum of the projector screen descending filled the sudden silence. Mr. Harrison. My attorney didn't offer a preamble. He didn't need to. The video he was about to play was the nuclear option, the piece of evidence I had prayed I would never have to use, but knew deep down was inevitable. Your Honor, Mr. Harrison said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. The plaintiffs have spent the morning describing a devoted son and daughter-in-law who were unjustly barred from their father's side. They claim Ms. King isolated Otis King to manipulate him. We submit this video evidence taken from a security camera installed in the decedent's private hospital suite on October 14th, 3 days before his passing, to clarify the nature of their visits. My parents shifted in their seats. My mother, Vivian, straightened her back, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for the first time. She looked at Luther, but my father was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. They had no idea. They thought their sins were committed in the dark. They forgot that I shone a light on darkness for a living. The video flickered to life. It was grainy black and white, but the audio was crystal clear. The date stamp burned in the corner, 11:42 p.m. The screen showed my grandfather Otis, frail and hooked up to monitors, sleeping fitfully in his hospital bed. The room was dim. Then the door cracked open. Luther and Vivian slipped inside. They didn't go to his bedside. They didn't touch his hand or smooth his blanket. They moved with the frantic, jerky energy of thieves. Check the drawers, my father's voice whispered from the speakers, distorted but unmistakable. He must have written the combination down somewhere. He couldn't remember what day it was half the time. He wouldn't trust his memory with the wall safe. On screen, my father began rifling through the bedside cabinet, tossing medical supplies and personal cards onto the floor with careless disregard. My mother, Vivian, went to the closet, patting down the pockets of my grandfather's hanging coat. It's not here, Luther, she hissed, her voice sharp with impatience. Stop making a mess and wake him up. We don't have much time before that nurse comes back. I can't just wake him up and ask for money, Vivian, Luther snapped, though he didn't stop ransacking the drawers. Why not? It's our money, she retorted. She marched over to the bed. In the video, my grandfather stirred. The noise had pulled him from his medicated sleep. He blinked, looking around the room, confused and weak. His eyes landed on them, and for a second he looked relieved. Luther. His voice rasped, dry as sandpaper. Vivian. We're here, Dad, Luther said, but he didn't move to comfort him. He stayed by the drawers, holding a stack of papers. Water, Otis whispered. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that rattled in his chest. He reached a trembling hand toward the plastic cup with a straw sitting on the tray table. Please, water. My mother was closer. She reached out and grabbed the cup, but she didn't bring it to his lips. She pulled it back, holding it just out of his reach. First things first, Otis, Vivian said. Her voice was cold, transactional. She pulled a folded document from her purse and slapped it onto the tray table in front of him. We need you to sign this. It authorizes Luther to access the safety deposit box at the main branch. We know you moved the bonds. Water. My grandfather begged, his eyes fixed on the cup. Thirsty. Sign the paper, old man, Vivian barked. The sudden volume made everyone in the courtroom jump. On screen, she leaned over him, using her body to box him in. You sign this and I'll give you a drink. You don't sign, you sit there and dry out. Do you understand me? Otis looked at his son. Luther, he pleaded. My father turned his back. He continued looking through the papers in the drawer. Just sign it, Dad. Don't be difficult, Vivian is losing her patience. I can't, Otis wheezed. Nara, where is Nara? Nara isn't here, Vivian shouted. She doesn't care about you. We are the only ones here. Now sign the damn paper, or I swear to God you won't get a drop. The video froze on that frame, my mother looming over a dying man holding a cup of water, like a weapon, her face twisted in a snarl of pure malice. The lights in the courtroom came up, but the silence remained. It was a thick, suffocating silence, heavy with horror. I looked at the judge. Judge Washington looked physically ill. His hand was gripping his gavel so tightly, his knuckles were white. He stared at the frozen image on the screen, then slowly turned his gaze to the plaintiff's table. There was a sound from the front row, a low, guttural moan. It was my father, Luther King. The man who preached about family values and respect every Sunday had collapsed forward. He buried his face in his arms on the table, his shoulders shaking. He wasn't crying from sorrow. He was hiding. He was trying to crawl inside the wood of the table to escape the hundreds of eyes boring into him. He knew. In that moment, he knew his life as a respected member of the community was over. Vivian sat frozen, staring at the screen. Her mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. She looked small. The arrogance, the eye-rolling, the high society posturing it had, all evaporated, leaving behind only the naked cruelty of what she had done. A juror in the back, though there was no jury, the court staff acted as one, whispered, "My God." Judge Washington's voice broke the spell. It was quiet, deadly quiet. "Mr. Sterling," he said to my parents' lawyer, "I have seen many things in this courtroom. I have seen greed, I have seen violence, but I have rarely seen such inhumanity." Sterling stood up, but he swayed. He looked at the video, then at his clients who were now radioactive. He closed his folder. "Your Honor, I need a moment with my clients." "I don't think a moment will help them," the judge replied coldly. He looked at me. "Ms. King, is there more?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding against my ribs. "That was just the beginning. Now I would like to show you where the money they were looking for actually went." My father let out a sob into his arms. He didn't look up. He couldn't. The weight of his own shame was finally crushing him, and I watched it happen without blinking. The courtroom remained in a stunned silence following the video evidence, but I did not give them a moment to recover. I needed to bury them under the weight of their own greed. I needed to show the judge that their cruelty was not just emotional, but transactional. I walked back to my table and picked up the thickest binder in my stack. It landed on the projector stand with a heavy thud that echoed like a gavel strike. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and cold. "The plaintiffs claim they need control of the estate to manage the family business. They claim my brother Terrence is a real estate mogul who needs capital to expand his empire. They claim my grandfather promised them this money to secure the family legacy." I opened the binder and placed the first document on the projector. It was a balance sheet. To the untrained eye, it looked like a standard financial report for a company called King Real Estate Holdings. But to me, it looked like a crime scene. "This is the fiscal year report for Terrence S. Company," I announced, pointing to the rows of numbers projected onto the screen. On the surface, it appears to be a legitimate enterprise, but when you apply forensic accounting principles, the facade crumbles. I pointed to a line item highlighted in yellow. $2 million in consulting fees, paid to a company registered in the Cayman Islands. I traced that company. It has no employees. It has no office. It has no website. It was incorporated the same week Terrence posted photos of his new penthouse on Instagram. I flipped the page. Another $1 million listed as construction costs for a development project in the suburbs. I pulled the permits. I checked the land registry. There is no building, Your Honor. There is just an empty lot in a swamp that has been designated as a wetland preserve since the 90s. You cannot build a doghouse there, let alone a luxury condo complex. My mother Vivian let out a small, strangled sound. She turned to look at Terence, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. She had believed the lie too. She believed her son was a genius businessman just waiting for his big break. She did not know he was running a shell game. "It is not a real estate company, is it, Terence?" I said, looking directly at my brother. "It is a laundromat. You take the money. Mom and Dad beg and steal from grandfather. You cycle it through these fake companies to make it look like legitimate profit, and then you siphon it out to fund your lifestyle. It is a classic money laundering scheme, and it is not even a very good one." Terence was gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table so hard his knuckles were white. Sweat was beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was watching his entire identity disintegrate on a projector screen, but the fraud does not stop with Terence. I continued, turning my attention to my parents. "It is a family tradition." I swapped the document on the projector for a series of bank transfers. "These are the records for the investment loan my parents took from grandfather 3 years ago. $500,000. They told him it was to buy into a promising tech startup. They told him it would secure their retirement so they would never have to ask him for money again. They wept at his kitchen table until he wrote the check." I held up a glossy invoice next to the bank transfer. "This is the receipt for a Lamborghini Aventador. It is registered to Terence King. The purchase date is exactly 3 days after the loan funds cleared my parents' account." I held up another receipt. "And this is a receipt from Tiffany and Company, a diamond tennis bracelet, $100,000. Worn by Brittany at the charity gala the following week." I zoomed in on the date. "Purchased with a debit card linked to the same account." The courtroom buzzed with low, angry whispers. Brittany instinctively covered her wrist even though she wasn't wearing the bracelet today. The shame in the room was palpable, heavy, and suffocating. "They did not invest a dime," I said, my voice rising just slightly, fueled by the memory of my grandfather worrying about his family's future while they robbed him blind. "They ate it, they drove it, they wore it. And when the money ran out, they came back for more. And when he said no, they tried to kill him. That was the breaking point. Terence could not take it anymore. The humiliation, the exposure, the destruction of his carefully crafted persona was too much. He shot up from his chair, his face a mask of panicked rage, knocking his water glass onto the floor. "Objection!" he screamed, bypassing his lawyer entirely. His voice cracked with desperation. "This is illegal. You hacked my accounts. You invaded my privacy. Those are private financial records. You cannot show this in court. You have no right." He looked wild. He looked like a man who knew the walls were closing in and was trying to push them back with his bare hands. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes bulging. "She is a spy. She stole those documents. Arrest her." I did not flinch. I did not even turn to face him fully. I just looked at him over my shoulder, my expression bored, my eyes cold. "Privacy." I asked, the word dripping with irony. "Terence, do you not remember where these records came from?" I picked up a document from the top of the pile. It had a court stamp on it. A very specific blue stamp that every debtor recognizes. "These are not hacked documents," I said, my voice ice cold, cutting through his hysteria. "These are public records from the bankruptcy filing you submitted 2 years ago. The one where you claimed you were destitute to get out of paying your contractors. You put all of this into the public record yourself to save your own skin. Did you forget?" Terence froze. His mouth hung open. He looked like he had been slapped. He had forgotten. In his arrogance, in his endless cycle of scams and lies, he had lost track of his own paper trail. He had exposed himself years ago, never thinking that his little sister, the boring accountant, would ever think to look. "You filed under penalty of perjury," I reminded him, driving the knife in deeper, "which means either you lied to the bankruptcy court then, or you are lying to this court now. Either way, you are done." Terence sank back into his chair. He collapsed as if his strings had been cut. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his parents. He stared at the table, defeat finally truly setting in. The judge looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. The gavel did not need to come down. The sound of Terrence's credibility shattering was loud enough to deafen everyone in the room. I turned back to the judge, closing the binder with a snap. I have one more piece of evidence, Your Honor, and this one concerns the future of the King legacy. I looked at Brittany. She was trembling, her face pale as a sheet. It was time for the final blow. Terrence sat in his chair, panting like a cornered animal. His financial crimes were plastered on the screen behind me, and his credibility was in tatters. But I knew my brother. I knew that when he was backed into a corner, he did not fight fair. He fought dirty. He looked around the courtroom, searching for a lifeline, a weapon, anything that could turn the tide of sympathy back in his favor. His eyes landed on Brittany's stomach. He stood up slowly, wiping the sweat from his upper lip. His demeanor changed instantly. The rage vanished, replaced by a trembling lower lip and watery eyes. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. Your Honor! He choked out, his voice cracking perfectly. I admit I have made mistakes with my accounting. I was trying to keep the family business afloat during hard times. I took shortcuts. I am not proud of it. But please look at the bigger picture. He walked over to Brittany and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but he gripped her tighter, forcing her to play the role of the devoted mother-to-be. My wife is pregnant, Terrence announced, his voice gaining strength. She is carrying the first king great-grandson, the heir to the legacy my grandfather built. Regardless of my financial errors, that child deserves a future. He deserves the security that his great-grandfather intended for him. If you strip us of everything, if you leave us destitute, you are punishing an innocent unborn child. You are taking the food out of his mouth before he even takes his first breath. My mother, Vivian, let out a loud sob, nodding vigorously. The baby, she wailed. Think of the baby. He is the future of this family. Otis would never want his great-grandson to grow up in poverty. Even Judge Washington looked momentarily paused. The mention of a child always complicated things. It introduced a variable of innocence that softened the hardest hearts. Sterling, seeing an opening, jumped up. Exactly, Your Honor, he boomed. We are talking about the welfare of a minor. Surely the court can see that regardless of the disputes between siblings, the estate should provide for the lineal descendants. The child is a blood relative of Otis King. He has rights. I watched them play their final card. It was a strong one. It relied on the one thing my grandfather valued above all else: bloodline and legacy. They thought they had found the moral high ground. They thought they were safe behind the shield of an unborn baby. I looked at Brittany. She was staring at her lap, her face gray. She was trembling so hard her diamond earrings were vibrating. She knew. She knew that I knew. And she knew that the shield Terrence was holding up was actually a landmine. I walked back to my table and picked up a slim white envelope. It was sealed with red wax. I held it in my hand, feeling the texture of the paper. It was light, but it held the weight of an entire marriage. I walked over to the plaintiff's table. I stopped right in front of Brittany. I did not look at Terrence. I looked only at her. Brittany, I said, my voice soft but audible in the silent room. Do you want to tell him? Or should I? Brittany looked up at me. Her eyes were wide pools of panic. She shook her head rapidly, a silent plea. Please, Don T., please. Terrence looked confused. Tell me what he asked, looking between us. What is she talking about, babe? Tell her to go away. I did not move. Last chance, Brittany, I warned. She burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. She could not do it. She was a coward to the end. Very well, I said, turning to face the judge. I handed the envelope to the bailiff, who walked it up to the bench. Your Honor, I addressed the court. My brother claims that this child is the heir to the King legacy. He claims that the estate should support his son. My grandfather, Otis King, anticipated this claim. In fact, he was deeply concerned about the future of his lineage. That is why 2 weeks before he died, he hired a private investigator to obtain a DNA sample from Brittany. Terence laughed a nervous, high-pitched sound. That is ridiculous. Grandfather was bedridden. How could he get a DNA sample? He did not need to leave his bed, I replied. He just needed his hairbrush. You see, Grandfather noticed that Brittany spent a lot of time with her personal trainer. He noticed the late nights, he noticed the phone calls, and he noticed that the timeline of the pregnancy did not align with your business trip to Dubai. I pointed to the envelope in the judge's hands. Inside that envelope is the result of a non-invasive prenatal paternity test performed by a private lab using fetal DNA isolated from maternal blood, which was obtained from a routine blood draw Brittany did at the King family clinic. Grandfather owned the clinic, Terence. Did you forget that? He authorized the extra test. Judge Washington opened the envelope. He pulled out the document and adjusted his glasses. He read it in silence. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked at Terence with an expression of profound pity. Mr. King, the judge said, his voice heavy. According to this report, the probability of paternity for Terence King is 0%. The air left the room. Terence stood frozen. He looked like a statue carved from ice that was about to shatter. He turned his head slowly, robotically, to look at his wife. Brittany was sobbing openly now, her shoulders heaving, making raw, ugly sounds of despair. 0, he whispered. The report indicates a 99.9% probability of paternity for a Mr. Marcus Sullivan, the judge read from the bottom of the page. Marcus Terrence's voice broke. My trainer. You slept with Marcus. Brittany nodded, unable to speak. Terence made a sound I will never forget. It was a wounded animal noise, a cry of pure emasculation and betrayal. His knees buckled. He did not sit down, he simply collapsed. He hit the floor with a thud, his expensive suit gathering dust. He knelt there, staring at the carpet, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The golden child, the heir, the future of the family was nothing. He was a cuckold. He was a fraud. He was a man who had built his castle on a swamp and now he was drowning in it. My parents looked like they had been electrocuted. Luther was gasping for air, clutching his chest for real this time. Vivian was staring at Brittany with such intense hatred that if looks could kill, Brittany would have combusted on the spot. Their legacy was gone. Their connection to the money through the baby was severed. I walked back to my table and started packing up my laptop. I did not need to say anything else. The silence of my brother's heartbreak was loud enough. I snapped my briefcase shut. The court is in recess, Judge Washington said quickly, banging his gavel. Medical assistance for Mr. King, please. As the bailiffs moved toward Terence, I looked at him one last time. He was still on his knees weeping. He had lost his money. He had lost his reputation. And now he had lost his family. I felt a pang of pity, but then I remembered the way he had laughed when I was cut out of the family photos. I remembered the way he had called me a loser. I turned my back on him. The truth hurts, I whispered to no one. But lies kill. The chaos in the courtroom following the revelation of the paternity test was slowly being brought under control by the bailiffs, but the atmosphere had shifted permanently. The air was thick with the smell of ruin. Terence was being helped back into his chair by a paramedic, but he looked like a man who had already died. His eyes were hollow, fixed on a point in the middle distance, seeing a future that no longer existed. Brittany sat as far away from him as the bench would allow, weeping softly into her hands, her social climbing ambitions lying in shards around her expensive heels. My parents, Luther and Vivian, were paralyzed. They looked from their devastated son to the judge like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. They were waiting for the mercy they believed their status entitled them to. Judge Washington shuffled the papers on his bench. He did not look merciful. He looked like an executioner who was bored with the pleading of the condemned. He picked up his gavel, but he did not bang it. He just held it, weighing it in his hand, a silent reminder of the power he wielded. Mr. Sterling, the judge, said, his voice cutting through the remaining murmurs. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented by the defense evidence of fraud, forgery, perjury, and a malicious conspiracy to defraud the estate, I am dismissing the plaintiff's petition with prejudice. That means you cannot refill, you cannot appeal. This case is dead. He tossed the file onto his desk with a dismissive slap. But we are not finished here. The dismissal of this lawsuit is the least of your client's problems. Ms. King has presented this court with substantial documentation regarding the mismanagement of Otis King's assets prior to his death. My father Luther stood up, his legs shaking. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. Your Honor, we can explain. Those were loans, family loans. We intended to pay them back. It was just a temporary cash flow issue. We are good people. We are pillars of this community. Judge Washington looked at him over the rim of his glasses. Pillars of the community do not steal from their dying fathers, Mr. King, and they certainly do not use shell companies to launder that stolen money into luxury vehicles and jewelry. Based on the forensic audit provided by Ms. King, which I have reviewed and found to be impeccable, I have probable cause to believe that a significant portion of your current assets are proceeds of crime. He turned to the court clerk. Enter an order immediately. I am issuing a temporary restraining order, freezing all assets held by Luther King, Vivian King, and Terrence King. This includes all bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and personal property. Nothing moves. Not a dime. Not a car. Not a watch. My mother let out a strangled cry. You cannot do that. How are we supposed to live? We have bills. We have a mortgage. We have a reputation. You should have thought about your mortgage before you spent your father's medical fund on a country club membership. Mrs. King, the judge replied coldly. And as for your reputation, I believe that ship has sailed. The judge looked toward the back of the courtroom. Bailiff, open the doors, please. The double doors at the back of the room swung open. The sound was heavy and ominous. 4 men and 2 women walked in. They were not wearing court uniforms. They were wearing navy blue windbreakers with yellow lettering on the back. FBI. Behind them walked 2 uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. The room erupted in whispers again, but this time they were whispers of fear. My parents turned around in their seats. When they saw the agents, their faces went slack. The arrogance that had sustained them for decades, the belief that they were untouchable because of their last name and their church attendance evaporated instantly. Agent Miller formed the Economic Crimes Division, stepped forward flashing a badge. Luther King, Vivian King, Terrence King. We have warrants for your arrest. My father grabbed the table for support. Arrest? For what? This is a civil matter. This is a family misunderstanding. It is a criminal matter, Sir Agent Miller said, his voice professional and devoid of sympathy. You are being charged with wire fraud, elder abuse, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Ms. Brittany King. We also have a warrant for you for insurance fraud regarding a diamond necklace reported stolen 3 months ago. Brittany shrieked. It was a high, piercing sound that grated on the ears. She jumped up, knocking her chair over. No. No, you cannot arrest me. I am pregnant. I am a mother. I didn't do anything. It was Terrence. He made me do it. He handles the finances. Terrence looked at her, his eyes dull. He did not even argue. He just held out his wrists as the officer approached him. He looked relieved almost. Prison might be easier than the reality of his life right now. The officer clicked the handcuffs onto his wrists, the metal ratcheting sound echoing in the silent room. My father tried to run. It was a pathetic attempt. He took 2 steps toward the side exit before an agent blocked his path. He crumbled. He fell to his knees, sobbing, begging. Please. I am an old man. I have a heart condition. You cannot do this to me. I am Luther King. I am somebody in this town. You are a suspect, Mr. King, the agent said, hauling him to his feet and spinning him around to cuff him. You have the right to remain silent. Then they came for my mother. Vivian King. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me because my shoes were not expensive enough was now being handled by a police officer like a common criminal. She tried to pull away, her dignity shredding with every second. "Wait!" she screamed. "Wait, just a minute. There has been a mistake. My daughter can explain." She spun around looking for me. Her eyes locked onto mine. I was standing by the defense table, calmly packing my laptop into my bag. I adjusted my glasses and looked at her. "Nara," she wailed, her voice cracking. "Nara, tell them. Tell them this is a mistake. I am your mother. You cannot let them take me. I gave you life. We are family. You have to help me. Save me, Nara, please." The agents grabbed her arms, pulling her toward the aisle. She fought them, her heels skidding on the floor. She reached out a hand toward me, her fingers grasping at the air between us. "Baby, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything. Just tell them to stop. I am your mother." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had locked me out of the house when I was 16 because I came home 5 minutes past curfew. I looked at the woman who had told my relatives I was a drug addict to explain why I wasn't at the family reunion when in reality she had just forgotten to invite me. I looked at the woman who had watched her husband loot her father's bank account and smiled because it bought her new earrings. I picked up my briefcase. I walked over to the railing that separated the court from the gallery. I stood just out of her reach. I looked her dead in the eye. "You are confused, Mrs. King," I said, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. "You do not have a daughter. You disowned your daughter 5 years ago because she refused to lend you $5,000 to cover your gambling debts. Remember, you told me I was dead to you." My mother's face crumpled. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by the crushing realization that her words had finally come back to haunt her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I turned to the agent holding her arm. "Officer, she has a history of hiding assets in her jewelry. I suggest you check the lining of her handbag and the heels of her shoes." Vivian let out a sound that was half scream, half sob, as the agent nodded and tightened his grip. "Take them away," Judge Washington ordered, his face grim. I watched them go. I watched my father weeping as he was led out the door. I watched Terrence walking like a zombie. I watched Brittany hyperventilating as they read her rights. And I watched my mother look back at me one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and despair. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. I was alone in the courtroom with my lawyer and the judge. I took a deep breath. The air tasted different. It tasted clean. It tasted like justice. For the first time in 32 years, I did not feel heavy. The weight of their expectations, their cruelty, and their greed was gone, dragged out in handcuffs. I was an orphan now in every sense of the word, and I had never felt more alive. The courtroom had transformed from a theater of law into a holding cell for the desperate and the damned. The gallery had been cleared of spectators, and press leaving only the essential personnel, the federal agents and the shattered remnants of the King family, huddled in the corner, near the jury box, waiting for transport to the county jail. The air was thick with the smell of nervous sweat and expensive perfume that had turned sour on the skin. I stood near the exit, my hand resting on the brass handle of the swinging gate, but I did not leave yet. I needed to see it. I needed to witness the absolute finality of their defeat, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I needed to be sure the monsters were truly caged before I turned off the lights. My father, Luther, was slumped against the wall. The man who had terrorized my childhood with his booming voice and his belt was now just a heap of wrinkling linen and gray skin. He was breathing heavily, clutching his chest with his handcuffed hands. When he saw me watching him, he straightened up just a fraction. The instinct to manipulate, to control, was so deeply ingrained in his DNA that even in handcuffs he could not stop himself from trying one last con. "Nara," He croaked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and calculated pathos. "Nara, baby, please. Look at your father." I took a step closer. The federal agent moved to intercept me, but I held up a hand. "It is okay, officer. I just want to hear what he has to say." Luther saw my approach as a weakness. He saw an opening. His eyes filled with tears that might have even been real this time, born of self-pity. "I am sorry, Nara," he wept. "I am so sorry. I know we were hard on you. I know we made mistakes, but we are family. Blood is thicker than water, baby. You cannot let them take me to prison. I am an old man. My heart is weak. I will die in there. Do you want that on your conscience? Do you want to be the daughter who killed her father?" He looked pathetic. He looked small. He was trying to use the same guilt he had used to make me give him my babysitting money when I was 12. He was trying to use the same fear he had used to keep me silent about his affairs. But the fear was gone. It had burned away in the fire of my own resilience. I walked right up to him until I was looking down into his watery, bloodshot eyes. I did not feel pity. I felt clarity. "You are not sorry you stole from me, Luther?" I said, my voice low and devoid of emotion. "You are not sorry you neglected grandfather. You are not sorry you called me a failure for 30 years. You are sorry you got caught. I am your father," he pleaded. "I gave you life. You gave me trauma," I corrected him. "And you gave me a reason to fight. You are right about one thing, though. You are an old man, but you are not afraid of dying in prison. You are afraid of living without your status. You are afraid of the world seeing you without your expensive suits and your stolen money. You are afraid of being ordinary." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut him to the bone. "You are not scared of a cell, Luther. You are scared of being poor. You spent your whole life running away from poverty, stealing and lying to pretend you were a king. And guess what? Now you are going to be a pauper in a cage. You will have nothing, no money, no reputation, no legacy. You will die with nothing, just like you deserved." He recoiled as if I had spit in his face. The mask of the grieving father fell away, revealing the snarling narcissist underneath. "You ungrateful witch," he hissed. "I should have left you at the fire station when you were born." "There he is," I said, stepping back with a cold smile. "There is the father I know. Enjoy the food in county jail, Dad. I hear it is exactly what you can afford." Before Luther could scream another obscenity, a commotion erupted next to him. It was Terence. My brother had been standing in a catatonic stupor since the paternity revelation, but something had snapped him back to reality. He was staring at Brittany, who was weeping into her hands, trying to shield herself from the agents who were cataloging her jewelry for evidence. Terence moved with a sudden violent energy that startled everyone. He did not lunge at me. He did not lunge at the agents. He lunged at his wife. He slammed his shoulder into her, knocking her sideways into the wall. Because his hands were cuffed behind his back, he used his body as a battering ram. "Marcus," he screamed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched shriek of humiliation. "My trainer. You slept with my trainer. I paid him $200 an hour to help me get fit, and you were sleeping with him in my house." Brittany shrieked, trying to scramble away from him, but the corner trapped her. She kicked out at him, her heel connecting with his shin. "You were never home," she screamed back, her face twisted and ugly with mascara running down her cheeks. "You were always in Dubai or Miami pretending to be a big shot. You were broke, Terence. You were a loser with a leased car. Marcus was a real man. He listened to me. He treated me like a queen. A real man." Terence roared, spitting flying from his mouth. "I bought you that car. I bought you those clothes. I stole from my own family to keep you in Prada, and this is how you repay me. Carrying another man's bastard and trying to pass it off as my heir. You are the bastard," Brittany yelled, clawing at his face with her manicured nails. "You are a fraud. Everyone knows it. Even your little sister is smarter than you. At least she has her own money. You have nothing. You are a joke, Terence. A broke, pathetic joke. The words hit Terence harder than any physical blow could have. He howled a sound of pure, emasculated rage and tried to headbutt her. The federal agents swarmed them, pulling them apart. It was a chaotic, humiliating tangle of limbs and shouting. "Get off me!" Terence yelled, struggling against the agents. "She is a whore. She ruined my life. I want a divorce. I want her in jail." "You are going to jail too, idiot!" Brittany shrieked back as an agent pinned her against the wall to handcuff her. "We are all going to jail because you are too stupid to hide a paper trail." It was a spectacle. It was a circus. The great King dynasty, the family that had walked into the courtroom looking like royalty, was now nothing more than a couple of brawling criminals turning on each other in the dirt. It was ugly, it was undignified, and it was exactly what they deserved. I watched them for a moment longer. I watched my father cowering in the corner, trying to dissociate from the violence. I watched my mother sobbing on the floor, clutching her empty ring finger where her diamond had been. I watched my brother and his wife tearing each other apart with the viciousness of rats in a sinking ship. They did not look at me anymore. They were too consumed by their own destruction. I was no longer the villain in their story. I was the architect of their demise, and I was already moving on. I turned away. I did not feel sad. I did not feel happy. I felt light. The invisible tether that had bound me to their toxicity for 3 decades had finally snapped. I walked toward the double doors, my footsteps echoing in the large room. Behind me, the sounds of screaming and struggling continued, but they sounded distant now, like noise from a television in another room. "Ms. King," the bailiff said as he held the door open for me. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and respect. "Do you need an escort to your car? There are reporters outside." I adjusted my glasses and smoothed the front of my suit. "No, thank you," I said. "I can handle them. I have handled worse things than reporters today." I stepped out into the hallway. The air was cool and quiet. I walked down the corridor past the marble statues of justice and law. I did not look back, not once. I left the screaming, the crying, and the begging behind those closed doors. I left the parents who never loved me and the brother who hated me. I left the sister-in-law who mocked me. I left the entire rotten structure of the King family to collapse in on itself. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, blinding sunlight of the afternoon. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the taste of the city. It smelled of exhaust and hot dogs and lake water. It smelled of freedom. I walked down the steps past the throng of reporters who were shouting my name, asking for a statement. I did not stop. I did not speak. I simply put on my sunglasses and kept walking. I had a lot of work to do. I had a foundation to build. I had a legacy to honor. And for the first time in my life, I had a future that belonged entirely to me. The wind at the Oakwood Cemetery was biting and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. But after the suffocating air of the courtroom, it felt like the breath of life itself. I stood in front of a simple gray headstone that read, "Otis King, beloved father and grandfather." There were no weeping statues or marble angels, just a plain marker for a man who had built an empire with his bare hands and lost his heart to a family that only saw him as an ATM. Mr. Harrison stood a few paces behind me, his hands clasped respectfully in front of his long wool coat. He had driven me here straight from the courthouse, shielding me from the press and the chaos. He held a thick leather portfolio under his arm. It contained the keys to the kingdom. $45 million in assets, the deed to the estate, the control of King Enterprises. It was enough money to buy a private island. It was enough money to never work another day in my life. It was enough money to turn anyone into a monster if they were not careful. I turned to face him. The wind whipped my hair across my face, but I did not brush it away. "Is it ready, Mr. Harrison?" I asked, my voice quiet in the vast silence of the graveyard. He stepped forward and opened the portfolio. He pulled out a stack of documents bound in blue legal covers. "Yes, Ms. King, The papers are drafted exactly as you instructed, but I must ask you one last time, are you sure? This is a significant decision. Most people in your position would buy a yacht, or at least a new house. I looked at the papers. I looked at the line where my signature was required. I did not hesitate. I took the pen from his pocket and pressed it against the paper using the leather portfolio as a desk. I am sure I said, I do not want their life, Mr. Harrison. I do not want the mansions that smell like lemon polish and loneliness. I do not want the cars that cost more than a teacher's salary. That money is cursed. My parents touched it. My brother touched it. It has their greed all over it. I need to clean it. I signed my name with a flourish, Nara King. With that signature, I transferred 90% of the estate into a new non-profit organization, the Otis King Foundation. I handed the papers back to him. The foundation will focus on two things, I said, looking back at the grave. Educational scholarships for children in underfunded districts, because grandfather always said a sharp mind was the only weapon they could not take away from you. And a legal defense fund for the elderly who are victims of financial abuse. No one should have to die wondering if their children are stealing from them. Mr. Harrison smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his tired eyes. He tucked the documents away safely. Otis would be very pleased. He always said you had a good heart, even if you hid it behind a ledger. I adjusted my glasses. I am keeping a few things, I added. I want the old brownstone on the south side, the one grandfather lived in before my father convinced him to move to the estate. And I want the car. The '69 Lincoln Continental, Mr. Harrison asked, raising an eyebrow. It needs a new transmission and the upholstery is torn. I know, I said, but it smells like him. It smells like peppermint and old leather. It is the car he drove me to school in when my mother forgot to pick me up. It is the only thing he owned that was just his. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly, understanding. He reached into his coat pocket again, but this time he did not pull out a legal document. He pulled out a small cream-colored envelope. The paper was yellowed with age and sealed with a simple piece of tape. He gave this to me 5 years ago, Mr. Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. He told me to keep it safe. He said to give it to you only after the dust had settled. He said that if you were the woman he thought you were, you would need to hear this today. I took the envelope. My name was written on the front in shaky block letters. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, covered in my grandfather's distinctive scrawl. My dearest Nara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have likely just fought a war. I am sorry I had to leave you to fight it alone. I am sorry I could not protect you from your parents when you were younger. I was weak, Nara. I let them dazzle me with their talk of legacy and status. I let them push you away because I was afraid of conflict. It is my greatest regret. But I watched you. I watched you from afar. I saw you leave. I saw you struggle. And I saw you rise. You did not ask for help. You did not ask for a handout. You built yourself brick by brick into a fortress. You are the only king who understands the value of $1 because you are the only one who ever had to earn it. Do not let this money change you. Do not let it blind you like it blinded your father. Money is just a tool, Nara. It is a hammer. You can use it to build a house, or you can use it to break a window. Your father broke windows. I believe you will build houses. You are the pride of my life. You are the only legacy that matters. Love, grandfather. I lowered the letter. A single tear escaped, rolling down my cheek and landing on the dry grass. It was the first time I had cried since the funeral. I had been so busy being strong, so busy being the auditor, so busy being the avenger that I had forgotten to be the granddaughter. He knew, I whispered. He knew everything. He did, Mr. Harrison said softly. And he knew you would win. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my pocket right next to my heart. I looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking and a shaft of pale afternoon sunlight was cutting through the gray, hitting the headstone. "I am done here, Mr. Harrison," I said, wiping my face. "The books are balanced. The debt is paid." "What will you do now?" he asked. I looked toward the parking lot where the old Lincoln Continental was waiting for me. "I am going to drive," I said. "I am going to drive until I find a place that does not know the name King. And then I am going to build something new." I walked away from the grave, leaving the millions behind, leaving the trauma behind. I walked toward the old car that needed a new transmission. It was not perfect. It was broken and worn. But it was mine. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I was going. It has been 6 months since the gavel fell in Judge Washington's courtroom, but the silence that followed has been the most beautiful sound of my life. The autumn wind off Lake Michigan is crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and change. I am standing outside the heavy steel gates of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, not as a visitor, but as a witness to my own closure. I did not go inside. I did not need to see them to know they are there. But I know the schedule. Right now, my father Luther is likely sitting in the common room, staring at a television he does not control, surrounded by men who do not care about his last name, or the silk suits he used to wear. He is serving 5 years for wire fraud and elder abuse. The irony is bitter and perfect. He spent his whole life terrified of being poor, terrified of being ordinary. Now he is a number. He is inmate 7429. He has no assets, no legacy, and no audience for his lies. And my mother Vivian. She is in a separate facility downstate. I heard from Mr. Harrison that she struggles with the prison laundry duty. The woman who once threw a teacup at me because I dared to exist is now washing sheets for strangers. She has no jewelry to hide assets in anymore. She has no bridge club to impress. She has only the 4 gray walls of her cell and the echoing memory of her own greed. They wanted a gated community where they would be safe from the world. They got one. I walked away from the prison walls and toward the curb where my ride was waiting. But it was not a taxi, and it was not my old Honda Civic. It was the Silver Cloud. My grandfather's 1955 Rolls-Royce. It was the crown jewel of his collection, the car he only drove on Sundays, the car my father had tried to sell 3 times behind his back. I had restored it. I had polished the chrome until it gleamed like a mirror and replaced the engine parts that had rusted from neglect. It purred like a giant content cat as I slid into the driver's seat. The leather smelled of peppermint and history. It smelled like victory. I drove into the city, the engine humming a low, powerful note. I was heading toward the financial district, but not to work. I had taken a leave of absence from the Federal Reserve to manage the foundation. Today, I was making a stop at a high-rise office building on Wacker Drive. It was the kind of building my brother Terrence used to dream of owning. He used to stand on the sidewalk and look up at the glass towers, telling anyone who would listen that one day his name would be on the top. I pulled the Rolls-Royce up to the curb. Through the massive plate glass windows of the lobby, I could see the cleaning crew working the afternoon shift. And there he was, Terrence. He was wearing a gray uniform that was 2 sizes too big for him. He was pushing a heavy industrial floor buffer back and forth, his eyes fixed on the scuffed marble. He looked older. The arrogance had been scrubbed off him, leaving behind a hollow shell. Brittany had divorced him the day after the assets were frozen. She had testified against him to cut a deal for herself, and then she had vanished presumably to find another host to latch onto. The baby was born last month. Marcus, the personal trainer, was raising him. Terrence had never even met the child he tried to use as a pawn. I watched him for a moment. I watched the brother who had called me a loser, who had laughed when I was excluded, who had tried to physically attack me for telling the truth. He looked up. Through the glass, our eyes met. He stopped the buffer. He saw the car. He saw me behind the wheel wearing sunglasses that cost more than his monthly salary. He did not scream. He did not gesture. He just looked at me with a profound, defeated sadness. He knew that he was exactly where he belonged. I did not smile. I did not wave. I just shifted the car into gear and pulled away, leaving him to clean up the mess of other people's lives, just as I had cleaned up the mess of ours. I drove north toward Lincoln Park. The trees were blazing with golden red, a tunnel of fire against the blue sky. I pulled up in front of a brownstone that was currently under renovation. Standing on the sidewalk, holding a set of blueprints, was David. He looked up as the Rolls-Royce approached, and his face broke into a grin that made my heart feel light. David was an architect. He was kind. He was gentle. He had met me 2 years ago when I was still just Nara, the auditor, and he had loved me then. He did not care about the $45 million. He cared that I liked old movies and that I snorted when I laughed. He was the one who had held me when I cried after the funeral. He was the one who told me I was strong enough to fight them. I rolled down the window. "Hey, handsome," I called out. "Need a ride?" David laughed, folding his blueprints. "Lady, that car is too classy for a guy covered in drywall dust." "Get in," I said, smiling. Grandfather would have liked a little honest dust. "It shows you actually work for a living." He climbed into the passenger seat and leaned over to kiss me. He smelled of sawdust and coffee. It was the best smell in the world. "Where are we going?" he asked, settling back into the plush leather. "One last stop," I said. "Then we are going forward." I navigated the car through the winding streets of the suburbs, heading toward the wealthy enclave where I had grown up. The streets were lined with manicured lawns and fences that cost more than college tuitions. It was a neighborhood built on appearances, on the desperate need to prove that you were better than everyone else. I turned onto the familiar street. I slowed the car as we approached the house. The King family estate. The house where I had been ignored. The house where I had been made to feel small. It looked different now. The grass was overgrown. The windows were dark. And planted firmly in the center of the lawn was a large wooden sign. Foreclosure. Auction pending. The bank had seized it 3 months ago. My parents had leveraged it to the hilt to pay for their lifestyle, and without the stolen money from my grandfather, the house of cards had collapsed. It was just a building now. It was wood and brick and mortar. It held no power over me. The ghosts that lived in the hallways had been evicted. David reached over and took my hand. "You okay?" he asked softly. I looked at the house one last time. I remembered the little girl who used to hide in the pantry to read because it was the only place she felt safe. I remembered the teenager who was told she was not smart enough. I remembered the woman who had walked into a courtroom and burned it all down. "I am better than okay," I said. "I am done." I squeezed his hand and then I put both hands on the wheel. I looked at myself in the rear-view mirror. I saw my grandfather's eyes staring back at me. I saw his strength. I saw his legacy. It was not the money. It was not the buildings. It was the integrity to stand up for the truth even when your voice shook. It was the courage to walk away from people who hurt you even if they shared your blood. I shifted the Rolls-Royce into drive. The engine roared a deep, throaty sound of power and freedom. I pressed the gas and the car surged forward, leaving the foreclosed house and the broken memories in the dust. I slid my sunglasses back up my nose. A small smile played on my lips as the wind caught my hair. "Game over," I whispered to the wind. And then I drove us home. This story reminds us that your true value is never defined by those who refuse to see it. Nara's family saw a failure, but the world saw a force to be reckoned with. It teaches us that silence is not weakness. Often, it is the most powerful weapon. While others are busy pretending focus on building something real. Integrity, resilience, and hard work will always dismantle greed and lies. You don't need to shout to prove your worth. You just need to be ready. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's succeeding on your own terms and walking away freely. If you believe in the power of standing up for yourself, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice served.